Hello, my name is Lisa Takahashi. I'm an artist, writer and teacher, and I'm here in the Jackson studio to introduce you to the wonderful world of watercolour painting. So what is watercolour paint? Watercolour paint is primarily pigment and gum arabic. So gum arabic is this clear, glossy liquid that comes from trees, primarily the acacia tree. It's a tree sap. And it has glossy properties, which can be lovely. You know, in your watercolor painting, you can actually add extra gum arabic to increase that gloss. Other ingredients are added to watercolor paint by manufacturers, things like oxgall. This helps with the brushability of the paint. Occasionally, you'll have honey, which makes the paint a little bit more moist and helps with the re-wettability of the paint. Glycerin will extend the drying time of the paint, and you'll get some antifungal agents. Things such as clove oil are often used, and that just stops the paint from going mouldy. Paint usually comes in pans, these little dry cakes of paint. These are probably the easiest thing to use. So if you're just getting started, I would always recommend pans, but you can also buy tubes of liquid watercolor. So this, you squeeze out the paint out of the tube just as you would with oils or acrylic, and they will dry onto your palette if you don't use them, but they will be re-wettable. There's also some large pans which can be really fun to use. Watercolor paint is also available in a stick form and also bottles of liquid with a pipette dropper in the lid, but I would begin with pans to begin with. We're often asked at Jackson's whether watercolour paints are vegan. It really does depend on the ingredients of each specific brand. If the paint just has gum arabic and pigment, then it would be vegan. But things like oxgall and honey obviously are not vegan. So if that is a concern of yours, I would avoid any paints that mention honey or oxgall, and you should be fine. You can, of course, make your own paints with these ingredients, gum arabic, pigment, a little bit of honey and so on, but it is quite difficult art in its own right. So I would always recommend starting with the ready-made paints, and then when you gain confidence, you might find that you want to explore the exciting world of making your own paints. But start easy and invest in some pans. Because watercolour paint is relatively simple in terms of its ingredients, it really lets the qualities of the pigments to shine through. There's very little complicating the paint formula. So what you get is a real luminosity and transparency that is unrivaled, really. So I'm just going to the thing about watercolour is that you are essentially working usually on a white surface, so that white surface shows through. It's allowing the reflectiveness of these transparent colours to really appear at their finest and most luminous. So as you can see, when you just put the colour on, for example, this rose colour has a sort of slightly granulating quality that is completely different to the orange that I've applied, which looks a lot flatter. So this is the sort of thing that you will gain familiarity with as you continue to paint. Each colour behaves in its own different ways. This cerulean is very transparent and has more granulating properties. And the final one I'm going to show you is French ultramarine, which is particularly known for having a coarser pigment particle size, which is what causes granulation. So when you saturate a piece of paper with paint, the pigments will pull together and create this sort of mottled texture. And this is something that, as you gain experience with your painting, you can use this to your advantage. You can really use it to bring out textures in your watercolor painting and make them look more dynamic. But these colours are really jewel-like, reflective, light-filled colours that will, have the potential to make paintings that really sing with colour vibrancy and brightness. Watercolour painting is as old as Paleolithic Europe. We're talking about the Lascaux cave paintings, which would have been made with pigment and tree sap of some kind. So essentially the same ingredients that you would get in a tube of watercolour paint today. A bit later on in the Middle Ages, watercolour paint was used to decorate religious manuscripts and scrolls. But really, the history of watercolour painting and the tradition of watercolour painting is very closely associated with British painting. Artists such as Turner, Constable, Edward Burne-Jones and Samuel Palmer, they're all artists that loved using watercolour, primarily for sketching prior to oil painting, but sometimes as a medium to create finished works of art in their own right. Moving more forward into more modern times, artists such as Paul Klee, Georgia O'Keeffe and Jean-Michel Basquiat, sort of artists that love to use watercolour as well. And I think it's mainly because watercolour is just so practical. You know, all you need is a little set of pans, such as this one, a water pot, some paper and some brushes, and you can just get painting. You can do it in the studio or out in the field, and it's pretty easy to set up. It sort of frees yourself up for creativity because there's very few practical concerns that you need to worry about. Just get painting and you can be as expressive and as creative as you care to be. So what do you actually need to get started with your watercolour painting? Well, I'm going to list some of the basic kit that I think everyone should invest in if you want to get started, and then talk through some additional extras that you may want to invest in as you gain more experience with your painting practice. I would suggest investing in a set of maybe 12 colours. This is a little 12 half pan set. You could really get started with something as simple as this. You can get even smaller sets, but I think this offers a good spectrum of colours. And the benefit of working with just 12 colours as opposed to something more elaborate, such as a set like this, is that it's easier to familiarise yourself with colour mixing. So what you'll find is when you start painting, you'll be dipping your brush into colours that are really very beautiful and very bright, but not very naturalistic in their sort of undiluted, unmixed state. So if I show you this yellow that I'm just applying, this is like a cadmium yellow, or for example, a French ultramarine. These aren't colours that you often see in the natural world like this, you know, so you will need to kind of muddy them up slightly just to make them more naturalistic. So for example, if you're interested in painting landscape and you invest in paints, you might find that you've got a green pan and it might look something like this. This is a Viridian. But when you go out into the field and try and paint, you know, pastoral landscape, rolling hills, this green is likely to not feature. So instead, what you'll want to do is start mixing your yellows and blues, and you'll find that you're making colours that have a slightly more realistic hue to them. And this is because you're combining pigments, and the more pigments there are in a colour mix, the muddier they look, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it means that you will be mixing colours that are more realistic. So I recommend 12 pans. You might buy a set of 8, or you might buy something as elaborate as a set of 24, but you run the risk when you buy a bigger set of actually not ending up using all the colours. So that's why I suggest 12. When you get your set, especially a set of this size, you'll find you've got a little area for mixing your colours, so it's a folding palette, and even in the lid of the set you will have some colour mixing space. A lot of the tins are a bit bigger than this one, so will give you more space, so you can get a tin like this and you've got a bigger palette mixing space. Or otherwise, if you want to keep things more compact, you can have your small tin and then invest in a separate colour mixing area. I really do encourage a lot of colour mixing areas when you're out painting, because it's just, when you're getting started, it's really important to familiarise yourself with how the pigments behave, and it's just a really good way to expand your knowledge of how watercolours work. So you can get palettes that are really huge, such as this one. If you're familiar with acrylic painting or oil painting, you might also be familiar with a very laborious sort of clearing up process, because, you know, these paints tend to dry and cannot be reactivated. But this is not the case with watercolour. So after a watercolour painting session, you can actually leave your palette like this and return to these colours again, which is fantastic. You know, if you need to stop your painting session mid-painting, it's not a problem. You're not going to lose the mixes that you've produced. All you need to do is put a lid on your palette, which will protect the colours, and then you can reactivate them. So for example, I want to start using this green again. I would just get a wet brush and move my brush on that bit of colour, and it's as fresh as it was the day I mixed it, and I can carry on painting. So really there's zero waste, because you can always use these colours. If you really feel, oh, I've had enough of this colour, you could just sort of wipe it away, of course. But for colours, I mean, continuation and colour matching is probably quite easy to carry on. The benefit of ceramic is that the colours won't bead up. And what I mean by that is that when you put your paints on a surface like this, they just stay as they are. But on plastic particularly, they have a tendency to kind of bead up into little balls, and it's quite hard to see the true colour of your colour mixes when that happens. There is a way of avoiding that. What you need to do is just grab a Brillo pad and give it a good scrub and then a good rinse, getting rid of any of the soap, because that soap might cause the paints to break down a little bit. So as long as you've thoroughly scrubbed it, then thoroughly rinsed it, then your plastic palette should work absolutely fine, just as well as a ceramic palette, which of course is a little bit heavier. So if you're going away traveling to paint, then this might end up adding extra weight to your painting kit. In terms of water, you must remember water. Can you imagine going painting out in the field? Maybe you're on holiday, you're in the middle of nowhere and you haven't got any water. It'd be a bit of a disaster. So always remember to take water with you. You can either take it in its own separate plastic bottle, or water pots like this have a little lid, and you can pop that in and it keeps it watertight. We also have collapsible water pots. So these are made of a sort of rubbery plastic. So really, really compact and easy to put into your bag. So paints come in different qualities. So at the top of the tree is the artist quality, and this will have the highest pigment load. So if you remember that the pigment is the stuff that gives the paint its colour, the powder. So this has got the most pigment to gum arabic. And then something like student grade has got slightly less. You will find cheaper paints in hobby stores that will have even less. If you're buying to start watercolour painting, I wouldn't recommend investing in those, because you just won't be rewarded with bright, colourful paintings, and you may run the risk of blaming your own painting ability when it's not the case. You will be better rewarded with student grade or artist grade paints. So what's the difference between student grade and artist grade? This one's quite messy. I'm just going to squeeze out, this is the artist grade paint, and then this is the student grade. So just put a little bit on that, on the palette. And I'm just going to show the difference between the two. So these are both phthalo blue paints. one key thing that you will realise when you start watercolour painting is that it's important to rinse your brush really thoroughly between brush strokes, and especially if you're changing colours, because the brush is very likely to hold on to previous colour mixes, and the more colour you have, the more mud you produce. So in the end, you'll get quite a muddy, dull painting. But this is an aside. I'll just show you the student grade phthalo blue, which, as you can see, is a lovely luminous blue. And then if I were to try my hardest to get the same amount of paint onto my brush, I mean, already I can see the difference on my palette actually, but when I put this down, it's deeper. The paint is going further. I could do several strokes with this, and it would just, there's a vividness that you can see with the human eye that really does show the difference between artist and student quality. So it depends on your budget. If you've got, you know, if you're not really worrying about how much you're spending on your kit, then invest in artist paints by all means, and what you'll get is a higher pigment load, and what that also means, as well as the luminosity and the depth of colour, you'll also see other characteristics that the pigments bring. So things like, if the pigment is slightly coarse, you'll get a kind of granulating texture, so tiny little grains of colour in your washes, and there'll be other, you know, finer pigments will produce more gentle, transparent colours, which are beautiful to apply as glazes or used in mixes. And those sorts of properties will shine through in your paint. Well, today I'm just kind of outlining the things that you would need to get started. I will offer one piece of advice in terms of your painting approach, and that piece of advice is to prepare your painting thoroughly. And what I mean by that is to do a really considered observational preparatory drawing prior to getting your paints out. You might be familiar with working with charcoal or pencil, but in terms of watercolour painting, I would advise drawing with graphite pencil. Once you've got your composition resolved, you can actually get the main composition, the outline, what I would call the design of your painting, onto your watercolour paper. And what I suggest you would use is something quite hard. So 2H pencil, you get grades of pencil that are considered F, the fine, or HB, or anything that says H is a hard pencil. And that means that the line will be crisp and light, and so it won't interfere with your painting. It won't be visible through the layers of watercolour paint. If you use something softer, anything with a B in it, so you've got 3B, 5B, 7B, 8B here, the higher the number, the softer it is. So 8B is the softest pencil, and that will give a very bold, smudgy, dark line. Unless you want that to feature in your watercolour painting, I would advise not to use that, because it may also be so soft that the pressure of a watercolour brush may actually drag some of that graphite across your painting and cause it to smudge. This is something that is a risk when drawing with charcoal as well. You know, it's that soft substance, soft powdery substance that will be dragged with a wet brush, and that will add a little bit of a black or grey to your painting and make it look a little bit muddy. So hard, crisp, sharp pencil. Make sure it's nicely sharp with a pencil sharpener. Any superfluous marks, erase them prior to putting your paint on, and they won't come through. So you just, it's like consider it like a map, you know, so it's a little guideline for where you're going to put your paint. As well as drawing, some other useful tools are sponges and masking fluid. So sponges we sell at Jackson's. They come individually or in a bag of assorted shapes and sizes. You can get synthetic sponges, but these are sea sponges, and naturally soak up liquid. So what you can do if your painting is very wet, you can still dab your painting with a sponge, and that can lift some of the colour away and give a little bit more texture, add a bit of light to your landscape. If your painting is dry, just wet it with a wet sponge and just dab, and you can lift areas away. It's also a good way of correcting paint marks. If you've made a mistake, then you can lift them away with a sponge. They're also useful for blotting. So if you find that your brush is too loaded with pigment or it's too wet and you make a mark and it bleeds out, and you want to have a little bit more control, rein it in a bit, make it a little bit drier, then just simply dab it onto your sponge, make the mark, and the mark should retain its shape. Nice crisp brush mark. Masking fluid is another really popular material that watercolour painters tend to invest in. It's a substance that you can apply to your painting to protect, to mask those areas. So for example, if you've got some rigging on boats, or if you want to have some light veins in a leaf, if you're painting nature, you might get something like a ruling pen, which is this implement here, which you can control the width of the nib with this cog on the side, and it opens and closes these two little blades at the top. And you dip it into your masking fluid and it holds the liquid in between these two blades, and you can control the width of the line with the cog, as I say, and you just drag this tool across your paper and it deposits a nice thin even line. You can apply masking fluid with a brush. What we suggest is you coat your brush with a little bit of washing up liquid prior to dipping it into the masking fluid, and that just means that when you're ready to wash your brush, once you've finished using the masking fluid, it will just come straight off the brush. If you don't use the washing up liquid, you run the risk of it drying in the brush and it becomes really difficult to get out of the brush hairs, and you may damage your brush. So that's a really good habit to get into. Masking fluid is available in white and a tinted blue version as well, and the reason is that the white one is really hard to see on paper, so you may not know where you've applied masking fluid, whereas this one you can see. Always apply masking fluid on completely dry paper. If it's on wet paper, it may bleed out and go into the fibres of the paper itself, and when you go to remove it, it may rip the paper, which will be really disappointing if you've made a really beautiful picture. You want to keep it nice and safe. So apply to dry paper and remove it as quickly as possible. How do you remove it? Well, you can use an eraser to just tease away a little corner, and then you should be able to rub it away with your fingers. If you've got a little ball of masking fluid that's already dry, it kind of acts as a sort of magnet almost. It will help prise away your applied masking fluid marks. And then voila, you've got the white of the paper shining through in these fine lines, just as you wanted them. As well as the sponge and masking fluid, there are a few other accessories that could come in handy. This is a brush rest. So when you're painting in your studio in particular, it's quite useful because as you finish, well, if you're working with multiple brushes and you want to keep them separate, you don't want the brush heads to touch one another in case they still have a little bit of paint on them. You might transfer inadvertently some paint from one brush to the other. So this brush rest will actually keep brushes separate from one another and keep you organised. You can easily locate the brush you need next. And it's particularly useful if you're working already with multiple brushes. If you're using just one brush, I wouldn't invest in one yet, but really good if you're working with half a dozen brushes, say. A spray bottle is also great for re-wetting a palette. Especially if you're painting outside, it might start drying, and it can just help to keep things liquid, especially if you're applying glazes and washes and so on, re-wetting that. You can also get some really nice sort of lovely textures and effects if you just lightly spray your painting itself. I'd advise that for more experimental painting approaches, but it can lead to some interesting effects. So if you're playing around with the medium and seeing what's possible, when you're going out painting, I'd always take some kitchen roll. It's just a nice backup to the sponge. It's a really good way of blotting your brushes in between applying brush marks. You can also use a kitchen roll to lift some paint from your painting if the passage of painting that you're working on is still wet. A little bit of kitchen roll just to dab can be really, really useful. Watercolour paint dries by process of evaporation. So effectively what you're doing is you're waiting for the water that you've added to the paint to evaporate into the air, leaving the pigment and the gum arabic to be sat on the surface and sort of absorbed into the paper a little bit. That's what you're left with. That's what your painting will be made of. So if you've applied a very attractive brush mark with crisp edges and you want to keep that, then it's really important you let that dry, because the thing is that while watercolor paint is re-wettable, it is possible to keep elements, crisp marks, visible through layers of paint, so long as they're sufficiently dry when you apply the next one. So you can speed the process up a little bit with a hairdryer. So if you've got a hairdryer at home, you've applied your mark, it's dried visibly, so you can see that it's dry, and even if you touch it, it might not do anything, but you know that there's a little bit of dampness. Maybe the paper is a little bit wrinkled still. If you grab a hairdryer, give it a good blast of that will just help to accelerate that process of the paint drying. And then once it's fully dry, you can apply glazes, apply other layers of paint on top, and you'll know that those brush marks will remain apparent with their crisp edges throughout the whole layers of paint. And that's what gives paintings depth, texture, luminosity. It's all about building up the layers with watercolour. Watercolour paper is usually made with cotton or wood-free cellulose is the full name. So basically wood fibres or cotton fibres. So it's completely different to cartridge paper or the paper that you might use to put in your printer, which has literally no absorbency. It's a very smooth, non-absorbent paper that is useful for dry media. Watercolour paper has a degree of absorbency, which means that the paint will slightly sink into the fibres of the paper, and that holds the brush mark in place. Cotton is naturally acid free, so that means that it won't discolour over time. There's no acid in the content that will cause any discoloration, and it won't become brittle. It's a fairly long lasting, what we would call archival surface on which to paint. Wood-free cellulose is wood fibre that has been treated to remove any acid content. So the wood from a tree naturally has acids in it, and if they were kept in the paper, that paper would eventually become brittle or discolour over time. So it's kind of boiled to remove that acid content, which means that the paper has a sort of archival quality about it. Watercolour paper is usually made on a machine, although it is sometimes handmade, as is the case with these sheets of paper here. And when it's handmade, you get these lovely rough deckled edges, which can be quite attractive. Well, there are cases where painters will retain that deckled edge because it's lovely to present your work with that edge intact. But when starting out, I would suggest that you invest in a pad of paper. It's just easy. You've got a few options. So basically, you could get a journal like this, which has the pages in. So if you're going on holiday, for example, you could keep a journal, record the things that you see that way. A spiral bound pad will allow you to flip the pages over relatively easily, and once you've finished a painting, you can just move on to the next one without having to sort of remove the paper altogether. So you can keep all your work fairly easily within a pad. Glued pads are the sort of thing, this is a black example, but it shows the same thing. Basically, it's glued at one edge, so the paper can be torn away once the painting's been finished. You just tear away your painting from that. The other solution is a block. So when paper gets wet, it has a natural tendency to shrink a little bit, and because of the nature of the fibers, it will do this in a slightly irregular way, which causes what we call buckling or warping. So your paper will get a sort of slightly bumpy surface to it. If you're using larger sheets of paper like this, you might want to stretch your paper to a board, but a block means that you don't have to bother with that process, which can be quite time consuming. So a block is glued on all four edges, so it feels solid. You know, you can you can't flick through the pages, they're all stuck together. So that will hold your paper taut. So when you do your painting, it will just keep the paper in position. And what you do is you wait for your painting to fully dry before you remove the top sheet. And you do this by grabbing a good old butter knife. And there's a little gap at the top edge of your block. And just make sure you're not getting more than one sheet, which is quite easy to do. And then you just slice the top sheet from the block. And this means paper stretching can be quite time consuming when you first start doing it. So to make the painting session as easy as possible, I suggest investing in a block. But of course, if you're working with fairly light applications of watercolour, then a spiral pad, the paper won't wrinkle too much anyway. So a lot of people tend to have spiral pads as well. So I'm just going to slice the top sheet off each of these blocks. I don't want to get too technical about paper making, although there's plenty of information on our blog and in our paper guide, but just a word about sizing. So watercolour paper has something called size in the pulp before the sheets are formed. This is essentially a glue, and it stops the paper from being completely absorbent. So if you imagine something like blotting paper, if you put watercolour paper on blotting paper, it would just suck up the paint, and what you'd get is a painting that is not vibrant because everything's just soaked into the fibres of the paper. The glue stops that from happening to a degree. So the glue or the size in the paper pulp will just allow a brush mark to sit partially on the surface and then partially sink in, so that it wouldn't just brush away. You know, it gives the painting a degree of permanency. So some watercolour papers are externally sized as well. So a surface of glue is applied to the formed sheets after they've been dried. They apply size on top, which means that when you stretch paper, which inevitably means that the paper will become wet, it won't wash away all of the size, which can be the case if it's not externally sized. It can become too absorbent. But this size, as I say, is just a way of ensuring that the paper behaves in a way that will optimize the appearance of your brush marks, make them look luminous, but at the same time make sure that they sink in a little bit and hold their place, hold their position, hold their shape. So these three blocks represent the three surfaces of paper that are available. So you have hot press, which is the smoothest, knot surface, which is also known as cold press, and that's got a slight texture, and rough is the heaviest texture, so it's got real dimples. And each of these textures is created by the way that the paper is made. So they're pressed between sheets of felt for the rough surface. That's what gives the rough texture. Cold press and hot press are pressed between metal cylinders, and obviously the hot press is hot metal, a lot more pressure, and so it gets completely smooth surface, and knot surface has a little bit of texture. Okay, so hot press, as you can see, completely smooth. Almost has a slight sheen to it. Not surface, a little bit of light texture. It's quite irregular. There's no regularity to these surfaces, and the rough surface has a more dimpled texture. And actually, what happens is the dimples cast very slight shadows, which means that the paper actually appears slightly creamier than the very smooth paper. So if I were to I'm just going to make a brush mark across the 3 textures. Actually, you need a bit more of a loaded brush, just bear with me. What happens on the rough surface paper is that the pigment seems to collect up into the dimples. So where the paint is sat in a more concentrated form in these dimples, you're going to get a greater amount of pigment, and that's why you'll see these darker dimples of colour. This happens to a lesser extent on the cold press surface, so you still have a little bit of dimpling, but not as much as the rough surface. And then on the hot press, there's no dimpling because the surface is completely smooth. And instead, with this particular paint, there is a degree of granulation, and so the pigment seems to have gathered up on the edges of the brush mark, which makes this really interesting crisp mark, as you can see. And it's not a completely even application of paint. You can see there's variations. There's light areas, mid-tone areas, and dark areas on the edges. And that is the characteristic of the pigment showing through. Which surface paper you use is entirely up to you. When you're getting familiar with the medium, I would always suggest using not surface because it's a happy medium between the very smooth and the very rough. Gives you a little bit of texture. Ultimately, texture means depth of colour because the pigment is sitting on the surface in an uneven way, which means that the pigment is either very concentrated or very thin, and that difference creates a vibrancy that you may not achieve to as great an extent on the hot press paper. So not surface is the one I would suggest, unless you have a very specific idea in mind, in which case go with whatever your gut tells you. So watercolour paper is measured in pounds per ream, which is the American unit, and usually written as pounds, or the grams per square metre, which is written as GSM on your watercolour pad. The standard weight is 300 GSM, which is 140 £. These units are really hard to imagine because who knows what a ream of paper looks like, or how heavy it is, or how heavy a square metre of paper would be. But once you start painting, you get familiar with these units and you understand that 140 £, weight is this kind of thickness of paper, which is what this is. If you're painting A5, A4, that kind of size, relatively small, or a little postcard, this isn't likely to warp very much with 1 or 2 layers of paint. So to get started, this is perhaps the ideal weight. If you're looking to paint something with heavier applications of water and paint, and you really want to try and avoid any kind of warping, then I would suggest you invest in something a little bit heavier. Maybe 200, 300 £, is quite a substantial, quite chunky paper, and it won't warp very much. If you are going to use heavy applications, then you may need to do some paper stretching. But to begin with, I would suggest 140 £, or 300 GSM in a block. It's glued on all 4 sides, so you can just slice off the top sheet when you're done, and your painting will be nice and flat. An easel is by no means an essential piece of kit, but you can invest in one. Say if you're starting to work on a slightly larger scale. I mean, a small pad of paper will just neatly sort of lean against the tabletop or on your lap. But if you want to work on a larger scale, then an easel can be useful and help you paint at a comfortable position. I've got a range of easels here. These table easels are ideal if you'll be painting at home, just, you know, place them wherever. This one has a handy storage drawer in the foreground. The storage drawer is to one side, so you can keep all your paints in there and then work on this easel. The platform goes down so it can sort of hang over the edge of your table, and you can also extend this up so it can actually accommodate quite a large board if you're working on a larger scale. And it can also be adjusted to sit flat. So if you're finding that you're working on something that you don't want to run, say you're applying a sort of quite a wet wash, you can then lean it so that it's flat and work on it, and then adjust it upwards, and it saves you having to readjust the levels to get the board out and so on. We've also got this more primitive table easel here without storage. Again, you know, you can adjust it to 4 different angles depending on what's comfortable for you. And as I say, if you're more horizontal, then you're less likely to have paint running down. And again, this adjusts upwards to accommodate a larger size, but the bottom stays where it is. And then this one is an H-frame table easel, which works much the same as an upright floor standing table easel. You can adjust the central mast which the platform is attached to, so you can get it to whatever height is convenient for you, whatever feels comfortable. And again, it can be adjusted horizontal or upright depending on what's comfortable. And then finally, if you're painting at home and you don't have lots of space, or if you're likely to be going out into the field or taking your paints with you on your travels, then a sketching field easel is a great investment. It folds neatly and buckles together like so, and it takes a little while to assemble, but the legs will extend outwards like so. And floor standing easel that is fairly robust and can be secured with tent pegs. So if they can get caught in the wind, especially if you're working on a large board. If that's the case, then I'd get some string and some tent pegs and just anchor your legs into place, and it should stay put. And it's really practical for both indoor and outdoor painting. So when you buy your set of watercolours, be it student grade or artist grade or whatever you're able to invest in, you might find, as is the case with this particular set, that you have a cute little brush here, and it's a retractable sort of travel brush. So you pull it out of its lid and then pop that onto the end, and then you've got a lovely little handle and a lovely round brush head. And you can just get started with one of these, so you know, you don't actually need to invest in any more. If you just start with this, as you go along you might think, oh, actually I'm craving a larger round, or I'm craving a more square-ended brush mark. You know, you start to sort of get a feel for it, and it really depends on the subject matter that interests you. So that's why I say it's kind of better to start with basic equipment and expand as you gain experience, because you start to learn what inspires you personally and your own painting approach, and that will dictate what you need. If you want to start with a few more brushes, here's a little introduction to what's on offer. So first of all, a round brush tends to have a pointy end, and so if applied, you know, if used lightly, it can produce very fine lines. If you apply a bit more pressure, then it will make a rounded, quite bold mark, and they are available in a range of sizes. Most brushes will come with this sort of plastic brush protector, and often the case is that they look so beautiful. They're beautifully pointed and shaped, and they feel quite hard, like this one hasn't been used yet and it's got sort of rigidity about it. That's actually just the gum arabic that I was talking about earlier in terms of the paint. They dip it in gum arabic and shape it, and that just protects it for transport. But as soon as you immerse the brush in water, that gum arabic washes away, and the water will, absorb. The brush will absorb the water. So then you can start working. So if you've got that sort of rigid hardness about your brush, then you need to rinse away that gum arabic, because that's just for transport purposes. So if you just do a fine line with your watercolour, you can vary the pressure and make a broader mark. And that, a round brush is probably the one I would go for. If you're just starting out, you just want one brush, I'd recommend a round. Other brush shapes, a flat is a square-ended brush, which is great for edges and sort of square-ended brush marks. So I'm just going to, so you can do a big sort of broad mark like so. If you have the paint quite thick, as I've done there, and you can also just use the corner of your brush to make a sort of completely different mark. So that's a really lovely brush to use. We've also got a filbert, which is like a rounded, it's like a flat, but with the sort of corners softened. And those are the sort of main brush shapes that I would suggest you use. Additionally, you've got something called a rigger, which is like a round, but it's much longer. And the benefit of a much longer hair is that it will hold more water. So if you like painting sort of marinas and boats and things like that, this is really good for the rigging of the boat, hence it being called a rigger. We've also got something called a fan, which is great for sort of texture. So if you're painting again like a landscape or even a floral scene, if you've got something that's sort of got lots of texture in the foreground, this can be really good for what you'd call a dry brush technique, which is when you don't really load very much water to your brush, you just put the pigment on and you stipple that texture onto your painting. We've also got here a deer foot, which is like a round with the sort of end chopped off, and that's another one which is great for texture. Finally, we've got things that are much broader. So we've got a hake brush, which is great for big washes, skies, laying in the initial layers of a painting. So usually what you do is you bring out the big shapes of a painting with a broad brush such as this, and then go in with a finer brush to add detail. A squirrel mop, which is a sort of almost like an onion shaped brush, usually with a fine point. If it's not there when it's dry, if you dip it in some water, it will come back. And this is good for fine lines as well as really broad brush marks. Watercolour brushes have a slightly shorter handle than your regular oil and acrylic painting brushes. And I think this is because you are more likely to want a more controlled brush mark. So you're likely to hold your brush closer to the actual hairs of your brush like that. But of course, if you are painting in a more expressive, loose way, you could use longer handled brushes that are usually used for oil and acrylic, but I would try and separate your brushes by medium depending on what you use them for. Watercolour painting brushes also come in a variety of different hairs. So you get something like this, which is a synthetic brush hair. The hairs tend to be quite silky, have a good spring, perfect for the beginner and professional alike. There are also a lot of natural hair brushes available. For example, a hake is usually made with goat hair, which is very, very soft and quite silky, and the brush hairs are much finer than some of the others, such as a badger. Badger hair is slightly more coarse, which is why it's particularly good for these sort of brushes that are designed for texture. and sort of more sort of dry brush technique. When you have a lot of pigment on your brush, you're probably looking for a more coarse hair such as this one. Then there's things like sable, which is another fine hair, particularly favoured by traditional watercolourists because it holds a lot of paint and water, so you can make long flowing lines, safe in the knowledge that you're not going to get a broken brush mark. Squirrel hair, also another very fine hair that is great for retaining water, which is why it's particularly popular for wash brushes such as this one. Huge amount of hair in this brush, so the liquid is kind of held between the filaments, and that's why you can make a really long brush mark with a natural hair brush such as a squirrel mop. So if you're mindful of avoiding animal products, I would recommend obviously investing in some synthetic hair brushes. But the reason why natural hair brushes are used and popular in watercolor painting is because they hold a lot of liquid and they're very sort of sympathetic to the characteristics of watercolor paint. So if you are going traveling, it's probably a good idea to also grab yourself a nice brush case so that you can protect your brushes in one of these. This is only one example. You've got things like brush easel case, which folds back on itself and the brushes sort of stick out, and it's quite good if you've got a tabletop. You can easily locate the brush you're looking for. But a brush case like this has got little pockets and you can keep your brushes safe and separated. So we're talking about bare essentials for watercolor painting getting started. I would say a pan set, 12 pan set. This is a bit bigger, but 12 pans across the whole color spectrum, which will be in a tin most likely with palette space. Something to put some water in. It could be one of these purpose-made water pots, or it could be a jar or a glass. You need a brush. One is fine, but more is better. Some paper to paint on, not surface ideally to begin with. And that's pretty much all you need to get going, maybe a pencil as well. And then if you want to invest in a little bit more, I would suggest some masking fluid, a sponge, an easel, and a brush rest, and maybe a water spray, and that's everything you'd be well equipped at that point.